Welcome to the front line of the Great Darkness, a period where Canada didn't just fail its children, it actively farmed them for profit and experimental data. Premier Maurice Duplessis didn't just lead a province, he operated a psychological meat grinder under the shadow of the crucifix. He sat beneath a gold cross in the National Assembly, handpicking every judge, every priest, and every doctor, ensuring that the law of the land was the law of the Father. But maintaining a traditionalist paradise requires a massive amount of capital, and Duplessis found it in the most vulnerable place, the nursery. In 1940s Quebec, being born illegitimate was more than a social stigma. It was a financial liability that the state decided to monetize. The church held the keys to the orphanages, but the government held the purse strings. When the federal government in Ottawa offered a mere 70 cents a day for an orphan's care, but a staggering $2.25 for a psychiatric patient, a terrifyingly simple mathematical equation was born. Why feed a student when you can profit from a lunatic? This was the architecture of the darkness, a system designed to manufacture madness for cold, hard cash. This was not a mistake. It was a $70 million industry built on the premise that a child's soul was worth exactly $1.55 in profit per day. As the first light of the 1950s hit the stone walls of these institutions, thousands of children went to sleep as orphans and woke up as inmates. They were the Duplessis Orphans, and they were about to become the primary export of the medical-industrial complex. The doors were locked, the windows were barred, and the records were stamped with a red M for mentally deficient. You are now deep inside the machine where the Sisters of Providence forced children to eat their own vomit and tied them to beds for days on end to break the spirits they couldn't sell. Imagine a classroom where the books are suddenly replaced by mop buckets and the teachers are replaced by guards and religious habits. This was the reality for over 20,000 children. The reclassification process was a surgical strike against reality. Doctors acting under the direct influence of the Union Nationale and the church began mass signing Form 14 psychiatric commitment papers without ever conducting a single psychological evaluation. The raw data from 1954 shows a spike in mental deficiency diagnoses that defies all biological logic. There was a pandemic of paper insanity. Once the red stamp hit the file, the child ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. But they were no longer eligible for adoption. They were no longer entitled to an education. They were expendables. In institutions like Mont-Providence and Saint-Jean-de-Dieu, the transformation was brutal. Children as young as 5 were stripped of their names and given numbers. They were forced into occupational therapy, which was a polite term for slave labor. They scrubbed miles of stone corridors until their knees bled, all while the institutions collected the insanity premium from the federal government. But the financial profit was only the first layer of the horror. To keep the premium coming, the children had to act like patients. If a child showed too much intelligence or resisted, they were treated. The treatments included ice-cold hydrotherapy baths that lasted for hours, straitjackets that were left on for days, and pharmacological restraints that turned vibrant children into drooling statues. The factory of madness was running at 100% capacity, and the shareholders, the church and the state, were getting rich on the misery of children who were insane only because it was profitable. While the world looked at the 1950s as a decade of progress, a darker shadow was moving through the halls of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. This is where the story of the Duplessis Orphans hits a level of crazy that most people think is a conspiracy theory, except the declassified CIA documents prove it. Enter Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a man obsessed with the idea that the human mind could be de-patterned and rebuilt from scratch. Under the secret umbrella of MK Ultra Subproject 68, Cameron received funding to turn humans into blank slates. The orphans, already legally classified as mentally deficient and lacking any parental protection, were the perfect non-persons for his research. This wasn't medicine, it was psychological demolition. Survivors described being subjected to psychic driving, where they were drugged into a semi-comatose state with massive doses of Thorazine and LSD, then forced to listen to a repeating tape loop for up to 16 hours a day. One survivor reported hearing the phrase, "You are a good boy," played over 500,000 times until his original personality fractured. They were given electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, at 40 times the standard medical dose, delivered in grids that burned the very tissue of their brains. This wasn't about curing them. It was about seeing how much a human mind could take before it simply stopped existing. The CIA wanted to know if they could program a person, and they used Canada's disposable children as the test subjects. The data harvested from these broken children would later be used to develop interrogation manuals used by intelligence agencies worldwide. The asylum wasn't just a prison, it was a research facility for the end of the human soul. The most haunting question of the Duplessis era is, where did the failures go? When you push a human body past its breaking point with experimental drugs and manual labor, people die. In the logic of the asylum, a dead orphan was a liability, but a buried one was a secret. Behind the Saint-Jean-de-Dieu hospital sat a patch of land known to the inmates as the pigsty. It was located right next to their community farm buildings where the hogs were kept, and for decades, it served as a convenient dumping ground. In 1967, a massive exhumation took place, but it was done in secret, and the bodies were supposedly moved to the Cimetière de l'Est. However, in 1975, when construction began for a liquor board building, the SAQ, workers made a discovery that stopped the machines. They were pulling small, human femurs out of the dirt. The pigsty wasn't a cemetery, it was a mass grave. Over 2,000 bodies are estimated to have been dumped there between 1873 and 1958, many of them unclaimed orphans who died from exhaustion, respiratory failure, or unknown causes during the height of the reclassification era. They were buried in cardboard boxes, often 3 or 4 to a hole, with no names, only numbers. Some survivors claim that children who died during treatments were simply disappeared into the night. The fact that a government agency was built on top of a field of child skeletons is the ultimate asylum visual. It represents a province that was literally willing to pave over its sins to keep the commerce of the Great Darkness moving. The bones in the pigsty are the silent witnesses to a $70 million profit margin that was paid for in blood. When the Great Darkness finally ended with Duplessis's death in 1959, the light that followed was blindingly cruel. The orphans were released into a society they didn't understand, carrying insanity labels that made them social pariahs. By the 1990s, the survivors, now elderly and broken, formed the Comité des Orphelins de Duplessis to demand justice. They didn't just want an apology, they wanted the truth about the money. Independent audits revealed that the Catholic Church and the Quebec government had pocketed roughly $70 million in adjusted currency from the insanity premium. But when the time came for a settlement in 2001, the asylum had one last trick. The government offered a $25,000 payout, a pittance for a stolen life, but there was a catch that was as dark as the original crime. To receive the money, survivors had to sign a legal waiver. This document prohibited them from ever pursuing legal action against the Catholic Church or the specific religious orders that ran the institutions. It was a hush money settlement designed to protect the very institutions that had profited from their misery. Many orphans living in extreme poverty because they had never been taught to read or write felt they had no choice but to sign. The state that had diagnosed them as deficient as children was now using their desperation to buy their silence as adults. It was the final red stamp on their lives, a legal gag order that ensured the Great Darkness would remain a secret for as long as possible. The survivors didn't just lose their childhoods, they lost their right to the truth. As we look back from 2026, the temptation is to say, never again, but the data tells a different story. The asylum isn't a building, it's a mindset that prioritizes administrative efficiency over human dignity. The Duplessis orphans were the prototype for how a modern state can disappear its problematic populations. Even today, the Mohawk mothers and the survivors of the Duplessis era are fighting to halt excavations in Montreal because they know the ground still holds secrets. They're fighting the same institutions, the universities, the government agencies, and the religious orders that have spent the last 80 years destroying files and misplacing medical records. The files for the orphans who were sent to the Allen Memorial Institute? Burned. The specific names of the doctors who signed the Form 14S? Redacted. The asylum protects its own. The story of the Duplessis orphans is a warning that whenever a government identifies a segment of the population as expendable, the machinery of manufactured madness will start spinning. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more madness.